For 36 years, a killer sat in the front row of his victim's funeral, shook hands with her grieving father, and watched an innocent man go to prison in his place. Somewhere in Ontario tonight, in a house you would drive past without a second glance, that same ordinary face aged into an old man's face, and for 36 years nobody came knocking. This is the story of a 9-year-old girl named CHRISTINE Jessop, the wrong man who paid for her murder, and the real killer who was hiding in the case file the entire time, written in plain, unremarkable ink, waiting for somebody to finally read it correctly. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up at night the way they keep us up at night, hit subscribe and tap that bell. Cold Case Vault posts a new case every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Queensville, Ontario in 1984 was the kind of town where nothing happened. A few hundred people, 60 kilometers north of Toronto, one general store, unlocked doors, kids on bicycles until the streetlights buzzed on. CHRISTINE Jessop was 9 years old, the youngest child in her family, adopted after her parents had waited nearly a decade to become parents at all. She had freckles across her nose, a beagle named Freckles who followed her everywhere, a shelf of baseball trophies in her bedroom, and a plan to grow up and become a veterinarian. On the 3rd of October, 1984, none of that mattered yet. It was just an ordinary Wednesday. Her father, Bob Jessop, was not home that day. He was serving a short jail sentence for misappropriating funds from a relative, a private, humiliating fact the family had kept quiet from the neighborhood. Her mother, Janet, and her older brother, Kenny, were out that afternoon too, driving into Toronto for a dentist appointment, and afterward, planning to visit Bob at the detention center. CHRISTINE, at 9, was not allowed inside a jail. So for one single afternoon, the only afternoon like it all week, CHRISTINE Jessop was going to be alone. Whoever took her knew that. The school bus dropped her at the corner of Leslie Street a few minutes before 4 in the afternoon. She had already made plans with her friend Leslie Chipman to meet at the park at 4, bring their dolls, and play until dinner. CHRISTINE walked home first. She let herself into the empty house. She dropped her backpack in her room. She hung her jacket on a hook. Earlier that day in music class, her teacher had handed out plastic recorders and written each child's name on a strip of tape. CHRISTINE said, in a child's careful handwriting, her own full name. She had been excited all afternoon to bring it home and show her family. She fished a nickel out of the change dish on the counter and walked to the country store down the road for a piece of bubble gum. A witness there remembered her clearly, smiling, polite, the recorder still in her hand. She bought her gum sometime in the final minutes before 4 o'clock, and then she walked back out the door. She never made it to the park. Leslie Chipman sat alone with her dolls that afternoon, waiting for a friend who was never going to come. When Janet and Kenny got home a little after 4, the house looked normal at first. Then the wrongness started creeping in. CHRISTINE's red bicycle was on its side by the shed, its kickstand bent, and CHRISTINE never left that bike like that. Her jacket was hanging on a hook well above where a small 9-year-old could have reached it. Her backpack was in her room. The mail was on the counter. But there was no daughter. Janet assumed she was out playing and started dinner. As the light failed and the evening came on, that assumption began to curdle into something else entirely. She called friends. She called their parents. She walked to the park herself. She checked the store. By 7 o'clock that night, she was calling the police, and the window, whatever window had existed for someone to take her daughter, had already closed nearly 3 hours earlier. York Regional Police at the time had almost no experience with anything like this. 1 officer for every 860 residents. No major crimes unit. No history of a child abduction, ever. What they did was what small departments do. They organized search parties. Within a day, hundreds of volunteers were combing 30 square miles of farmland. Helicopters passed low over the fields. Dog units moved through the bush. Divers searched every pond in the county. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other walked shoulder to shoulder across freshly turned soil, looking for a 9-year-old girl in a hand-knitted blue sweater. Bob Jessop was released early from jail on compassionate grounds 3 days later, and he came home to a house gone completely silent. By Halloween, Queensville streets were empty of children. Cards started arriving from strangers across the province. Janet kept every single one. When Christmas came, the Jessops did not put up a tree. Janet said later that decorating would have felt like giving up on her. On the 31st of December, 1984, day 89 of the search, a man was walking through a wooded field near the small town of Sunderland, about 56 kilometers from Queensville. His dog had wandered off and he was looking for it. He found Christine instead. Her recorder was beside her, her name still taped to it in that careful child's handwriting. Her corduroy pants and small running shoes were nearby. The blue sweater she had been wearing that day was gone, and it has never, to this day, been recovered. She was buried on the 7th of January, 1985, at the small cemetery beside her own home. 250 people came, many of them her own classmates. The Reverend spoke of sorrow and fearfulness, and of anger, that something like this could happen to a child like her. We're only getting started, and this case gets darker before it gets any kind of justice. If you're still with us, type the word recorder in the comments right now so we know you made it this far. That small detail is going to matter more than you think. Because Christine's body had been found in Durham Region, the investigation now belonged to Durham Regional Police, and 2 detectives were assigned to lead it. By the middle of February, the case had gone cold and the community wanted an arrest. On Valentine's Day, 1985, the detectives sat down with Janet Jessop again, and this time she mentioned the family next door. The Morins had lived beside the Jessops since 1978. The father was a retired engineer, the mother a retired teacher, and one of their adult sons, a quiet man in his mid-20s named Paul Morin, still lived at home. He worked as a furniture finisher at a plant in Toronto. He kept beehives in the backyard. He played clarinet and saxophone in local community bands. He was reserved, a little awkward, deeply attached to his parents. In the mythology of a small town, that was enough to feel strange. Janet described him to police as different from the other neighbors. That same night, one of the detectives wrote a note in his file describing him, in essence, as an odd young man who played clarinet. That single, throwaway line of a working theory would go on to consume the next 10 years of Paul Morin's life. 8 days later, detectives picked him up for what they called a friendly conversation in their car. He agreed without hesitation. He told them he had barely spoken to Christine, that once, when her dog got loose, he'd helped her catch it. That was the entire relationship. What he did not know was that the conversation was being recorded, and when investigators played the tape back, there was nothing on it that could convict anyone of anything. So the story that entered the file was that after the tape recorder had supposedly been switched off, Morin had said something strange and unprompted about innocent little girls growing up to become corrupt. From that point forward, there was only one suspect in the Jessop case, and it was him. In April, an undercover policewoman approached Morin at his band practice pretending to be a hairdressing student, looking to practice her craft. He let her cut a few strands of his hair. She sealed them in an envelope and walked away. That same month, the FBI produced a psychological profile of the likely killer. A local white male, 19 to 26 years old, almost certainly known to Christine, with a probable history of voyeurism or arson. Morin fit the age. He fit the town. He had no arrest history for either voyeurism or arson, no history of violence at all, but the parts of the profile that fit were kept, and the parts that didn't were quietly set aside. At the Center of Forensic Sciences, a scientist compared the snipped hair to a single strand recovered from a necklace on Christine's body and reported the two as microscopically similar. Not a match. Similar. To the detectives building a case, that distinction stopped matching. Investigators also searched Morin's car and found fibers that were, again, microscopically similar to fibers on Christine's clothing, a similarity with an obvious innocent explanation nobody wanted to hear, since the two families lived 30 feet apart and used the same laundromat in town. That explanation never made it into the theory of the case. On the 22nd of April, 1985, Paul Morin was driving to band practice when police lights lit up behind him. The two officers who walked up to his window were the same two who had chatted with him weeks before. He is reported to have greeted them casually, joking that it was them again. They told him he was under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessup. He asked if they were serious. One of the detectives is said to have told him they did not make mistakes. He was interrogated for 6.5 hours at Whitby jail. At one point, investigators showed him an enlarged photograph of a fingerprint and told him it had come from Christine's clothing. It hadn't. It had come from his own clarinet. It was a bluff, and he still did not confess because there was nothing to confess to. He kept repeating the same sentence over and over, that he had not done this. But by then, the machinery of the case had already decided who he was. We're at the halfway point, and this is exactly where the case starts to unravel into one of the most disturbing miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. Comment the word innocent below if you believe Guy Paul Morin never should have spent a single day behind bars. And stay with us, because what happens next in that courtroom will make your blood run cold. His parents mortgaged their home to raise nearly $500,000 in bail. His father told reporters simply that he knew his son, and that his son had not done this. Morin's defense fell to one of the most respected criminal lawyers in the country, and the first trial opened on the 7th of January, 1986. The defense laid out a timeline that seemed, on its face, impossible to overcome. Morin had clocked out of work in Toronto at 32 minutes past 3 that afternoon. Even driving straight home, the earliest he could have reached his own driveway in Queensville was somewhere around 4 o'clock. Christine had already disappeared by then. His parents testified under oath that he had arrived home around 5 that evening, carrying groceries. The prosecution had no real answer for the groceries, so they simply moved past them. There was one loose thread the prosecution needed to pull. Janet and Kenny had originally told police they arrived home at 10 minutes past 4. If that time was accurate, Morin could not physically have been the one who took Christine. So detectives returned to the Jessops, again and again, gently suggesting that perhaps the kitchen clock had been wrong that day. Under that steady, repeated pressure, Janet eventually said that maybe she had gotten home closer to 4 o'clock exactly. That revision, a matter of a few minutes, opened a new 20-minute window in which Guy Paul Morin could theoretically have committed the crime. He had not committed the crime, but now, on paper, he had time to. The prosecution called 2 jailhouse informants who had been housed near Morin, one a career petty criminal later described in court as a pathological liar, the other known publicly only by an alias. Both claimed Morin had confessed to them. Both had struck deals for reduced sentences of their own in exchange for their testimony. An undercover officer also testified that Morin had made unsettling remarks referencing horror fiction, which prosecutors framed for the jury as something close to an oblique confession. Morin's lawyer ran an unusual dual defense, arguing first and primarily that his client was simply innocent, but building a second argument in reserve, that if the jury did believe the confession evidence, Morin should be found not criminally responsible due to mental illness. Morin himself reportedly hated that second argument, refusing to see himself in it at all, but his lawyer was trying to give the jury every possible door out of a wrongful conviction. On the 7th of February, 1986, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. In the Jessup family, in that courtroom, there was stunned, aching silence. Kenny wept. Bob Jessup told reporters outside that the family had lived through a year and a half of hell, and that the hell was not over yet. He was right. The Crown appealed, arguing the trial judge had misdirected the jury on the legal standard of reasonable doubt. The appeal succeeded. A second trial was ordered, and in 1992, 7 years after his arrest, Guy Paul Morin sat in a courtroom again while prosecutors rebuilt their case around a theory that strains belief even now. That Morin had lured Christine into his car that afternoon by playing his clarinet through the window, that a musical child like her would have been drawn irresistibly to the sound, and that this was how she came to leave with him. The jury believed it. On the 30th of July, 1992, Guy Paul Morin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison for a killing he had never committed. Before we go into what happened next, and it is the part of this story that changed the Canadian justice system forever, hit that like button if a wrongful conviction like this one makes you as angry as it makes us. Cold Case Vault relies on viewers like you sharing these cases, so if you haven't already, subscribe now so you never miss how this one finally ends. While Morin sat in a Canadian penitentiary for a murder he did not commit, A new science was quietly maturing outside the walls of that prison. It was called DNA analysis, and it had not been reliable enough for a courtroom in 1985, nor even fully in 1992. By the middle of the 1990s, it was. Investigators had preserved 4 small biological samples recovered from Christine's clothing years earlier. 3 had degraded beyond any usable analysis. 1 single, tiny sample had not. It was tested against Guy Paul Morin's own DNA, and the result left no room for interpretation. The sample did not belong to him, could not belong to him. It belonged, instead, to the actual killer, whoever that was. On the 23rd of January 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and entered an acquittal. Guy Paul Morin walked free for the second time in his life, nearly 10 years after his arrest, and stood in front of a bank of cameras to say the same thing he had been saying since the beginning, that he had not done it, that DNA had now proven it beyond any doubt. His father, asked for a comment, said only that after 10 years, nobody had ever believed them, and asked how many times the truth was supposed to have to be repeated before someone listened. The government of Ontario eventually paid Guy Paul Morin and his parents jointly $1.25 million in compensation. He gave half of it back to his parents, to help cover the legal costs that had nearly taken their home. The Attorney General apologized publicly. But one question remained, hanging over the entire province, unanswered and unbearable. If Guy Paul Morin had not killed Christine Jessup, then who had? Ontario ordered a public inquiry to find out, led by a respected judge. It ran for 146 days, heard from 120 witnesses, and reviewed more than 100,000 pages of evidence. The final report ran nearly 1,400 pages, with over 100 recommendations attached to it. His findings were devastating. The investigation, the judge concluded, had suffered from what he described as tunnel vision of staggering proportions. Detectives had settled on Morin as their suspect within days of first hearing his name, and every piece of evidence gathered afterward had been bent, consciously or not, to fit that conclusion. The hair evidence was declared essentially worthless. The fiber evidence, it emerged, had been contaminated in the lab, and at least one staff member had known about that contamination as early as 1986 and never disclosed it to the defense. One of the original prosecutors broke down while testifying at the inquiry and said, on the record, that she was not proud of having taken part in the prosecution of an innocent man. Janet Jessup was asked, gently, why she had ever revised her account of what time she arrived home that day. She said simply that maybe she had been wrong, and that she was sorry if she was. And then she said the sentence that would follow her for the rest of her life, that this entire inquiry had stopped being about her daughter, and had become, instead, only about Guy Paul Morin. The judge closed his report with a line that is still quoted in Canadian law schools today, that an innocent man had been convicted of a heinous crime he did not commit, that science had helped convict him, and that science, in the end, had set him free. The case reshaped the country's approach to jailhouse informants, forensic testing standards, and police tunnel vision, and it directly led to the creation of the wrongful conviction advocacy organization now known across Canada simply as Innocence Canada. But the real killer was still out there. And for another 25 years, he stayed there, hiding not in the shadows, but in plain sight, inside the very case file that had convicted the wrong man. That is where the second half of the story begins, and it is, if anything, even harder to sit with than the first. Somewhere in those original police records, buried under the weight of tunnel vision, was a name that had already crossed the investigators' desks in 1984. A name belonging to a man who had been close to the Jessup family. Close enough to be trusted completely. Close enough that nobody ever thought to look twice. A man who sat in the front row at Christine's memorial service, who embraced her mother, who signed the guest book, and who, only 2 days before Christine disappeared, had sat in his own living room while she laughed on his couch beside her mother. The man's name was Calvin Hoover. He was not a stranger. He was not some drifter passing through Queensville that October afternoon. He was Bob Jessup's friend, close enough to be trusted with the kind of things you only tell people you love. Their families were intertwined in the ordinary, unremarkable ways that make a small town feel safe. His wife and Janet were close. His children had played with Christine and Kenny. He had sat at the Jessup's kitchen table. They had sat at his. In the days after Christine vanished, Hoover had been listed among the people close enough to the family to be interviewed as a matter of routine, one name among many gathered in those first chaotic weeks of 1984. He gave his account. He was not pursued further. And then the investigation's tunnel vision closed around Guy Paul Morin instead, and Calvin Hoover's name simply stopped being looked at. He was in the family's grief the entire time. He attended Christine's memorial service and sat near the front. He embraced Janet Jessup as she mourned her daughter. He signed the guest book, his name recorded there in his own handwriting, filed away with all the other names of people who had come to grieve alongside the family. He had been on the list of visitors to the Jessup home. His photograph existed in the family's own albums. And only 2 days before Christine disappeared, she had been sitting in his living room, laughing beside her mother, in a scene so ordinary that nobody in that room could have imagined what it would come to mean. For 36 years, that was where his name stayed. Not hidden in some forgotten archive nobody thought to search, but sitting, in plain and legible ink, inside the same case file that had already destroyed one innocent man's life. Calvin Hoover went on living an ordinary life after that. He kept working. He raised his own sons. He moved between small Ontario towns over the following decades, the way people do, chasing jobs and cheaper rent and quieter streets. Nothing about his life afterward marked him as anything other than unremarkable. And in 2015, Calvin Hoover died, never having been questioned again about the afternoon of the 3rd of October, 1984. His death did not end the story. It changed how the story could finally be finished. In October of 2020, a detective sergeant named Steve Smith was working through Ontario's cold case files using tools that simply had not existed when Christine died, or even when Guy Paul Morin was wrongfully convicted, or even when DNA first cleared him in 1995. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same emerging science that had by then cracked open dozens of decades-old cases across North America, allowed detectives to compare old, preserved biological evidence not just against a single named suspect, but against family trees built from public genealogy databases, distant relatives, second and third cousins, branches of a family nobody involved in the original case had ever thought to climb. Detective Smith typed a name into a database. It was a name that had been sitting quietly in the Jessup file since 1984. And the case, dormant for 36 years, lit up in front of him. The DNA sample once compared and cleared against Guy Paul Morin, the same single surviving fragment that had exonerated an innocent man in 1995, was compared again. This time it matched. Calvin Hoover, dead for 5 years by then, was confirmed through DNA analysis and genetic genealogy to be the man who had murdered Christine Jessup. There would be no trial. There would be no interrogation room, no jury, no verdict read aloud in a packed courtroom. The man responsible had died believing, as far as anyone could tell, that he had gotten away with it completely. He had watched an innocent neighbor be arrested in his place, convicted, imprisoned, exonerated, and compensated, and through all of it, he had kept attending community events in the same towns, kept raising his own children, kept living a version of an ordinary life that Christine Jessup would never be allowed to have. Janet Jessup, by then an elderly woman who had spent 4 decades going to bed with the same unanswered questions circling her mind, finally had a name. Not a trial. Not a confession. Just a name, confirmed by science, 36 years too late to matter to the man who owned it, but not too late to matter to her. Guy Paul Morin, for his part, had spent those same decades trying to rebuild an ordinary life after the 10 years the justice system had stolen from him. He had never stopped saying the same 6 words he said the day he was first arrested. I did not do this. In the end, he never had to say them again because the case file that once destroyed him now finally, quietly, confirmed them. The Christine Jessup case did not just end with the identification of her real killer. It permanently changed the Canadian justice system that failed her family twice, once by convicting an innocent man, and once by having the real one written down in the file the entire time. It is the reason jailhouse informant testimony is treated with such suspicion in Canadian courts today. It is the reason forensic labs disclose contamination instead of burying it. And it is the reason an entire generation of investigators are trained, explicitly using this exact case, to recognize the moment their own theory has stopped following the evidence and started leading it. Christine Jessop was 9 years old. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a beagle named Freckles and a shelf of baseball trophies. And on the last afternoon of her life, she was excited to show her family a plastic recorder with her own name written on a strip of tape. The window that made her vulnerable that day was only ever 7 minutes wide. The window that let her killer walk free afterward was 36 years wide. And it stayed open because everyone was looking at the wrong door. If this case affected you the way it affected everyone on our team while researching it, that's exactly why Cold Case Vault exists. Subscribe now so you never miss a case. Drop a like if you think justice for Christine Jessop came far too late, and tell us in the comments which case you want us to cover next. We'll see you in the next one.